Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. This is going to be a super fun webinar. I have an amazing guest here, Francis from Matt Kudo. He's the CPO at Matt Kudo. And so we're going to talk about the really interesting, somewhat even say controversial topic around product-led growth. It's going to be a ton of fun. But while we're waiting for some people to tune in, I always love to start off with a good question of the day. And so before I ask the question, I did want to just remind everyone that this is a Zoom meeting, not a Zoom webinar. So if you want, you're more than welcome to flip on your camera, and there is going to be opportunities as well if you want to raise your hand, to jump in and engage. The goal of this webinar isn't to put you to sleep one bit. We want to keep this super engaging, keep you on your toes a little bit. And so the more you can engage and bring to this, the more fun this is going to be at the end of the day. Thank you, Trent, for jumping on video. Great to see you. I love all those books. Happy to see that. All righty. So while we still wait for some people to tune in, this is the question of the day. Francis, take it away.
Yeah. So before we started, we were asking like, what's kind of your like a favorite actor you might have? And actually, yeah, Wes, I'm curious. Like, I gave you mine just before, and I'm happy to share that one again. But like, maybe what's yours?
Oh, this is like growing up as a kid. My like first crush, like Reese Witherspoon. So yeah, that was my favorite actor for the longest time. And
Nice.
yes, ever yours.
Yeah, mine I was mentioning was is Nick Cage, and I feel that he's a very interesting actor. I think he brings a lot of controversy to the table. Like a lot of people will have super strong opinions about his acting. And the funny thing is, even when you ask people who just say he's a bad actor and you ask them about like Lord of War or National Treasure, they'll say, yeah, those are good movies. And you realize that there's actually more under it. And the more I started reading into analysis of his movies and even his commentary, he kept on saying that he likes to challenge the kind of default assumption that good actors have to be very realistic. And he kind of like takes this more opera approach of like at the opera, people are super far away from the stage. So you have to overact everything to make sure everyone understands it and understands kind of the gesture, like the emotion you're trying to convey. It's super interesting to take that to the small screen. And it just like creates a very different aesthetic to it. And I think it's interesting to challenge that, even just for the sake of remembering that in the first place, like, realism isn't the only aesthetic that is worthy of being filmed. And I think I like also the approach of thinking that it's trying to bring the user and the viewer kind of a different experience. And I think that kind of, to some extent, is a good metaphor for a lot of what we're talking about today. And I think it's to some extent something that people can have a strong opinion about, but it doesn't really hurt, right? No one's going to be offended by your opinion on this topic. So it's something that I like to use.
Awesome. And so, yeah, to kind of break into today's topic, thanks for pulling up the slide. Oh, Gretchen Benedict. Love him in Doctor Strange. Yes. Sherlock. Absolutely. Mary, got to see Mandy if you haven't.
Yeah. Agreed.
Absolutely. Thanks for jumping in there. And yeah, so today's topic, super fun. One of the things I really like most about this, we went through the webinar yesterday in preparation for today. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is just how important knowing what's going on in the account it is for a product-led business, because we often look at users and users tell you one part of the story, one little journey. But for a lot of us in B2B SaaS companies, there's a lot more that goes on outside of just that one user. There's accounts, there's multiple users going on. So how do you really understand that whole picture? So it truly is at the heart of scaling a product-led growth business. You got to understand that part. So Francis, want to kind of take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that. I guess like before we start, kind of a typical housekeeping, but yeah, please submit any kind of questions, comments in the chat, and Wes and I will try to keep as good of an eye as possible on those. And yeah, if there's anything that's like relevant in the moment, we'll definitely take it, but we'll also have some time towards the end for a bit of a Q&A. And we might even potentially like pull you on stage if you want to have like, if you want to interact on that question. That's like the whole point of having a Zoom call rather than your traditional kind of webinar session. This will be recorded, so yeah, we'll send the recording. So don't worry if there's like something that you want to rewatch or whatnot.
Awesome. And on that note too, like if anyone has questions, since this is a Zoom meeting, you can always just raise your hands like I'm doing right now. It'll kind of take you to the front of the line. And so we will definitely be prioritizing people who raise their hands. But if you're a little shy and you just want to ask the question in the chat, there is that option as well, but would strongly encourage you to raise that hand as we're going through the presentation. It can make it a lot more fun, a lot more interactive. So encourage you to do that.
Sweet. Cool. And jumping into it, for those who don't know who we are, I think most of you do, but we're big nerds about product-led growth. And that's, I think, pretty much like the extent of the intros needed for today. But I guess, yeah, jumping right into it, you know, when we think about anything in general, right, in companies, there's always going to be kind of the three pillars that we want to look at, and it's going to be like people, process, and technology. Just want to set the stage that for today, we're not really going to cover the technology piece. Ultimately, it's pretty straightforward. You should use MathKudu. That's the only tech you need. But more seriously, like tech is really, I find that today we have a little bit too much of this tendency, in part because of the marketing that's out there, to try and compensate like lack of strategy with an abundance of technology. And I think today I really want to focus more on like kind of some of the fundamentals and the strategy and how to think about like scaling the PLG success. And then like the technology that you put on top of it, I think is very often something that's replaceable, but like the processes and like how you align people internally and how you think about, you know, making PLG work at your organization is something that cannot be replaced, and really is so fundamental that I wanted to spend some time on that. And so the first part, this is what you're going to see is relevant in the whole kind of presentation, and it is something that I actually find companies sometimes struggle with materializing and really just like coming to an agreement and just the realization that this is how it actually works. So when you have a PLG go-to-market motion, what typically is going to happen is that you are going to have different funnels, and one of the ways you know, we think about breaking them down is really from kind of the more self-serve to the more handheld. And so you're typically going to see this like traditional kind of self-serve motion, which is very inspired from the B2C world of, you know, people come in, they use the product, they become engaged, and at some point they swipe the credit card and you get revenue. And then all the way on the very handheld side, you're going to have the more kind of enterprise sales style of going to market, which we're now coining ABM as a cool rebranding of enterprise sales. And that's really like figuring out which are the big accounts you want to go after because they carry a lot of potential, and trying to figure out how you generate penetration from a marketing perspective and then from a product perspective within these accounts in order to then generate revenue. And the interesting thing here is that every company, every user you go after is going to have a stronger affinity towards one of these funnels, right? So you have processes that are going to also optimize for different funnels here, but then you have different affinities, right? So if you're going after like a big, I don't know, let's say in the banking industry, it's going to be really tricky to have the self-serve approach because typically the regulation is so high that it's really hard to get that self-serve adoption and that kind of like bottoms up sales motion. That's why traditionally in highly regulated industries, companies are still going to operate in a more top-down approach just because of these kind of requirements there. But so I think it's really critical that as a company, you understand what your mix is today in terms of funnels and really just like understand what those funnels are and how each of them can actually feed the other and where you want to go and focus some energy.
And could I just jump in there with this slide? So I'm curious, since we have about 72 people here, which funnel best represents your company? Are you more self-serve? Are you more sales assisted? Are you bottoms up, top down? If you want to just drop it in the chat. Melissa Johnson, great to hear from you. It's been a while. Sales assisted. Awesome. Anyone else want to share? All right, so we got a lot more
sales assisted.
Good. Top
Self-serve.
down.
And actually, one thing I'll do a quick shout out while people are filling this in to, I would recommend go to Redpoint's website and actually Thomas Tongu's blog. He had an awesome article on the impact of adding sales to self-serve. It was really interesting to see how across all the price range, so even if you're selling like 5K annually up to like 100K annually, having sales assist in the PLG motion actually increased the conversion rate across the board. So they ran a survey against a bunch of companies, and yeah, thanks for sharing it, Wes. Definitely recommend checking that one out. I mean, nothing earth-shattering, but it's always like kind of helpful to see those numbers and to get that take to validate your assumptions internally. But so yeah, actually, so there's a lot of sales assist and a couple top down. Cool. So I think that's like a good segue into scaling sales in PLG. And this is really, I wanted to start with kind of the sales assist motion and maybe start with a bit of a customer story that I think that I've seen multiple times and is probably somewhat relevant to what you have. So in this particular case, so this is something that we presented back in the day with Envision at HubSpot's conference. And so for those who don't know, Envision, like one of the early successes in PLG, massive adoption from, freelancers that are going to do projects on a website all the way to big enterprises. So really like the full scope of selling from, really small to like complex deals. And what was really interesting is that in their journey, I think they kind of like established some of the blueprint of how you should approach this sales assist motion. So the first thing they focused on was making sure that, their MQL optimization was nailed. So they really focus on like first thing we need to, get perfect is make sure that for every hand raiser we get, we are talking to them quickly. We have a clear SLA, we have clear and like really quick routing. And so when we started working with them, what we had seen is that like there was so much work that had been done on the MQL and like MQL meaning like really hand raiser side that we're kind of hitting diminishing returns. And then they, decided to say, okay, on that part, we're now good. Let's start looking at PQLs and like product users to see, can we actually extract any kind of pipeline from that? And that's exactly what we did. And what was interesting there is that on the PQL side, so now if we're looking at volumes, kind of the red bar here is going to be the volume of PQL. So like leads that were surfaced as being like highly engaged and from a great company that could actually yield revenue from a sales assist motion. So the red bar in PQLs is much higher volume than the MQLs. But then of course in conversion rate, we're seeing like the hand raiser conversion rate compared to the PQL conversion rate. So what we were seeing is that the conversion rate really wasn't there, and it was a big struggle to get more of these, PQLs to turn into opportunities. And so obviously, as a marketer, the first thing you think about when you see that is what the hell is sales doing? And you start wondering, well, is my sales team just not talking to the right leads? Are they not pushing the right message? Are they breaking the SLA? Anything of the sort. And where I think this is like so cool is that for Envision in particular, sales was really not the culprit. Like their SLA, their sales ops team is incredible. And they were really like touching all of these leads on time, was the right message. It was like really relevant. We kind of did a bit of an audit of the emails that they were sending. And when we actually spent time talking to the sales team to get the feedback from them about this, they were saying, well, we are talking to the right leads in the sense that these people are actually engaged in the product. They are from companies that we do want to talk to, but they just like as a company aren't ready to buy. Like they themselves might swipe the credit card and buy like 1 or 2 seats, but there hasn't been like enough account penetration to actually go to the higher ups and discuss like a bigger team plan. And I think this is something that happens in almost every single collaboration heavy company that I see with a PLG motion where there is the expectation that there'll be multiple users. And I think one of the core reasons why that is the case is that PLG kind of came from the B2C world. And in the B2C world, we have a very linear concept of onboarding and how to sell, right? So people sign up for the product, they get value from it, they engage in a recurring manner with the product, and at some point they've gotten so much value that they're okay swiping their credit card and starting, giving you money. The problem is that this journey isn't like the right one when we think about B2B, because you're going to have very often this is something that we see, like people who sign up and become a paying customer automatically. And this is like one of the things that I keep on seeing customers, brains explode when they look at their data and like, we don't get it. Like, most of the people who swipe the credit card do it within the first day after the sign up. How is that possible? And it's basically because, yes, they sign up and pay, but there might be someone else from the account who's actually getting value from the product before. It might not even be in the same account from your perspective, but it's the same company. And similarly, you have people who are going to sign up only to just invite more people, generate more signups, and potentially one of those signups is actually going to become the paying customer. And so the way kind of I think about it, and one of the stories I keep on using here is that B2B sales to me is like the Lord of the Rings. And it's probably hard to read, but this slide is essentially the storyline of the Lord of the Rings, and every line is one of the characters. So this is like the full plot of the trilogy. And what's really interesting is that I could summarize the Lord of the Rings in one sentence, right? It's like a bunch of people, it's a fellowship who decide they want to destroy a ring. They, toss it from the top of a volcano, and that's it. But there's a lot more that happens there. And there's a lot of different characters that are critical to the plot and are going to have very different impacts. And what's interesting too is that you have people that might have conflicting interests, right? If you think of the humans and Boromir and the whole like Gondor group, like they want to take the ring for themselves because they want that power. And like that is something that we see a lot, where you might have like an internal team that actually doesn't want to let go of their power. And so they don't want you to come in as a vendor because then they have less footprint and control over the company. And so they might want to take the project for themselves. And it's important to understand who those are, because you can transform them into champions who will then like sacrifice themselves to save the fellowship, but they can also potentially like kill the deal completely. And so I think that complexity and understanding like the who's who in your buying cycle is really critical to make sure that you design an onboarding that is going to embrace that complexity of the account. So yes, exactly. I think definitely time to watch the full Lord of the Rings and the extended version before the next time. So I guess like the takeaway here is really when you think about your customer journey and kind of redesigning it, I would say like, if for any reason, like someone in the company will tell you, oh yeah, the journey is like people sign up for the product, get value, and then buy, that's when you know you have a problem and you want to spend a little bit more time looking at it from like a domain perspective, like take all the signups from a domain and see like how each of them interacted with the product, just to show that there's actually more complexity there. And in B2B, just embrace the fact that there is that complexity, and that your reps need to know that even though they're talking to one person, there's going to be a lot of other personas in the background that they need to bring in to actually close these deals, which is one of the reasons why it's so hard to make, PLG work in the enterprise.
And I know Massimo put in the chat too, like we've had companies with 30 plus individual or a few like subscriptions, and yet the company is really not a customer yet. Like, I think that just goes to show like, absolutely, like this journey is in Lord of the Rings, there's 30 plus characters. Yet it's like still at the end of the day, it's like, it doesn't all necessarily fit together in one plot. So yeah, that makes sense.
And you also need to identify almost like who's Gandalf, right? Who's the person who's going to instigate the whole thing and kind of like bring this together, where instead of just like 30 characters that are living their lives, to have like all of this come together and realize, oh, there's like a greater good that we want to get to. And you need to get that person to be sold on the idea. And like the cool thing about the story again is like Gandalf isn't the person you see the most in the movie. He's actually absent for like quite a while, but he's still like that critical person that kind of starts the initiative. It's almost like the executive buyer, the person like triggers the whole story and then is going to come back and close the deal towards the very end. So maybe jumping into from kind of like the idea of selling to like further in the enterprise. And I think, we started talking about it, like these challenges, like many people who are active become even bigger in the enterprise. And typically what we see is that companies are going to succeed initially in the sales assist, and they start closing like one or two bigger deals. And then they realize, oh, wow, maybe there's an opportunity to go and close, like 6-figure deals in the enterprise with a PLG motion. And how do we actually make that happen? And one of the challenges that I see a lot of companies run into, and this is one that we were discussing with Miro, they're having massive success, right, on the PLG side. And what was interesting is that they were seeing, well, a lot of our enterprise deals are actually coming from hand raisers. And the problem is that as a marketing team and a demand gen team, we don't really know how to generate more hand raisers. Like, we're super excited when they come in because we know they're most likely going to yield an enterprise deal afterwards, but we need to figure out a way to identify before people raise their hand accounts that are ready for an enterprise outreach and will actually yield some enterprise pipes. So that's like a challenge, again, that we see a lot of companies facing, where if they kind of look at their mix of enterprise pipeline and you try to figure out, like, where does my enterprise pipe come from? What you typically see is that 90% of the pipe is really going to come from hand raisers, which unfortunately from a demand gen perspective is something that you have very little control over. Like, even though your CEO is probably asking you, oh, can't we just get more hand raisers? The answer is no. There's no easy way to go and do that. And typically we see that some part of it is going to come from like some power users, like some of these PQLs that actually at some point raise their hand and like open an enterprise deal. And quite a bit is coming from these accounts where there's like 30 people active. And unfortunately, I think some of it is now like coming also from this like more target account. And I think that's where ABM to some extent is so sexy and appealing, because like, well, we don't really have control over MQLs, and we don't really know how to necessarily like get more enterprise pipe from the product. So why don't we do what we used to do, right? Enterprise selling, and rebrand it as ABM. It's kind of an allure out there that we can go and find accounts that have some like intent through Bombora or Sixth Sense or one of those tools. Like, there's these companies out there that are researching our space and they're not necessarily using our product, but if we talk to them, they will buy our enterprise product. And I think that is one of those where it might seem appealing, but it's going to be rough to make work. And you have a huge pool of product users and active accounts that actually you can source a pipeline from. And maybe to answer, I know Deepa had a question on like the definition here of MQL, like for a lot of PLG companies, what I've seen is that like the MQL almost becomes synonymous of really the hand raisers, because it's kind of it's a marketing action, and it is kind of the marketing action that leads to a handoff to sales. So I do tend here to use hand raiser and MQL kind of interchangeably for that purpose, just to separate from what could be considered an MQL with a reason PQL, meaning like it's a marketing considered the leads is ready for sales, and it's through the product qualification.
Yeah, no, so, I understand the basic definition. The reason why I asked is that, sometimes the MQLs are defined as, someone has attended an event and they MQL, and, they shouldn't necessarily MQL just because they've attended an event. They should have taken a series of actions. So I was just curious how this is defined at MadGuru.
Oh, got it. So yeah, and then it really depends on how heavy of a like product-led motion you have. For us, actually, yeah, the MQL is going to be like, there is like the hand raisers, which are the obvious MQLs, and then we have the more traditional MQLs where like based on webinar content, all that kind of engagement. And I think and we'll actually talk about this one on the in the PQL side. I think that for PLG companies, I typically, you still want to have like this kind of MQL outreach, but generally you also want to leverage the product to like take these MQLs, and like the nurture track should have a big path towards the product of saying, well, these have shown engagement with like webcasts and webinars and that kind of content. Let's try and get them to engage in the product so that then they can yield active accounts. And so actually exactly on that topic, like when we think about like the funnels for each of these, right? Like this hand raiser kind of MQL funnel is pretty straightforward. Someone raises their hand, we mark them as an MQL. Generally, that becomes an opportunity. We close them. Everyone's happy. Then on the product side, what's interesting is you're going to have these product users that reach a certain level of engagement, and then they become a PQL. And then that's when there's one track where some of these PQLs are going to raise their hand. That's generally like a small percentage. And the alternative is to try and actually get them to yield active accounts by inviting more people to the product. So it's almost like the goal of the PQL is to organically, create some virality and invite more people to join the account. And really, like the part that I think on the, again, like on making enterprise work in PLG, like really the key to this is to figure out how to get more of these active accounts and how then to convert the active accounts into revenue. And again, there's similar to what we just mentioned, kind of two path, like you're going to get to the point where you have these like 30 active users in an account and someone is going to come and raise their hand. This is again, something that's going to happen organically, but unfortunately is something that is difficult to really drive more of, rather than saying, well, now you want to figure out how to convert PQAs into opportunities, and that's going to be sales outbound, right? So it's getting your sales team to understand once an account has been identified as being active, like the example of saying we have 30 active people using the product, how do we figure out how to generate an opportunity from that account? And that's really kind of an outbound motion on the sales side. And the one thing I will say, we talked about how like tech is generally not the most important. This is a part where a lot of companies struggle because historically, typically, right, the sales reps have been used to working hand raisers, which is a motion of an inbound, like someone is saying, hey, I want to talk to you, please help me. And now you actually have your sales team that needs to go outbound to these accounts. It's a very, very different kind of approach. And that is where like people and process is going to be critical to make sure that your VP sales is bought into the fact that you have to coach your team to sell in this email that's trying to generate an opportunity. It's not just, hey, here's my Calendly, let's book a meeting and talk money. It's really like, this is why your company is going to get value from upgrading to an enterprise plan with us. And these are like some of the things that will help in order to then get them to actually talk to you. Did want to mention that because I think it's an area where a lot of folks stumble, and they are going to do a good job at identifying the PQAs on the marketing side, but they're not yet at the point where they've enabled the sales team well enough to actually convert the PQAs into opportunities.
And Francis, Eric had a great question about like for active accounts, do you consider that like just an existing account or is it something different?
That's a great question. Typically the easy way to look at it is going to be if you look at your existing like product accounts is one way. We actually, the way we think about it, we look at it as the starting point is looking at just domain, removing of course like personal domains and saying like how many active users do we have within a given domain. That gives us a sense for how active the company is. And then if we go maybe like, I don't know if like the question is for more specifically even for Salesforce or something like that. But then, yeah, you want to have like that mapping in Salesforce, say for every account or every like domain, you typically want to have an account in Salesforce and then be able to kind of like route all the users to that so that you're able to aggregate some basic numbers. Like this is one of the questions that Wes has, like, how do you get started with this? Like an easy way is just how many active leads or contacts do we have within this account? And that is like a very easy way to get started in the prioritization of like, these are the accounts we're going to go after because they have the most number of active users and are not, of course, on an enterprise plan. And I like that approach because it's an easy way to say we have identified PQAs and now let's work on the handoff with sales and like the messaging before we actually look at something a little bit more sophisticated. So that's when then we get to the point where now we need tech. Like we have the people and processes in place, and now we need to bring in some tech that's a little bit more sophisticated and just like counting the number of users.
And Eric, you're killing us with these great questions. I love it because you got another good one, which is like, do you really just use the PQA for upselling or cross-selling expansion stage of the customers? Like I know Miro, maybe you could give that as an example, because I think that's a really interesting one where they could just be looking at the users individually. They have that potentially for like an individual account, it might be more of that linear approach to onboarding. But then there is like, they could look at, okay, there's like, 30 people from HubSpot.com here. Like we could look at this as a product qualified account, as an upsell opportunity. Absolutely. So there's lots of ways you could look at it, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it, Francis.
Yeah, I think you can use it for everything. I think what makes an account qualified for one motion, either like net new versus an upsell to enterprise or a cross sell, would be a little bit different, but it's definitely something that we recommend. So yes, it is something that you can use it for. I just think it's like the definition of what is a PQA within the context of net new enterprise acquisition versus upselling versus cross-selling for a specific other product that they're not using. How you define something as a PQA is going to be slightly different, because you might want to look at have they used one of the features that is relevant for this cross-sell, or like, are they a company that might have higher security needs and therefore would warrant kind of an upsell just based on that. So the question of active users, is it coworkers they invite to the product? Yes and no. That's like, again, starting point. If someone has been invited, yes. But I think that's where having some kind of meta definition of what is an account that is like a little bit beyond the product account is so important, right? Of saying, like in the example that was mentioned when I can't remember who said it actually, the 30 active users, it was Massimo. The 30 active users might not even be tied to the same account, but it might be the same company, right? So if I see like 30 people from Sendbird that are like interacting with potentially like different instances of Mad Kudu, it's actually telling me, oh, something's happening at Sendbird, and I want to have this like understanding that there's 30 people from this company that are interacting with the product. So that's why I think having some kind of a like automated roll up there is important. Then when you go into the really, really big enterprise, and this becomes a little bit more challenging because now you're going to have, well, like I have Trimble US, Trimble UK, and like IBM US and IBM Canada. And you don't necessarily then want to roll those together, because that's where then your hierarchy structure is critical in Salesforce, because you want to use that as the primary hierarchy and then default to domain if you don't have a clear allocation. Because in those cases, you know that the buying entity is actually going to be the local entity and not the like just domain level one. So again, there's lots of complexity there, and you can like over time like chop things a little bit narrower, but that's kind of the general concept. And cool, it sounds like it answered Deepa's question also on like using the PQAs for ABM accounts. I think maybe slightly different take there, and actually we'll open the kind of the ABM approach was like target accounts. I think that's where I mentioned it a little bit, but like the highly regulated industries, like the kind of companies where you know that product adoption and this kind of bottom-up sales is going to be difficult because they don't have this natural inclination to test products and to drive adoption through that. And like banking is, like the finance sector is like definitely one of the interesting ones where you actually rather want to go towards a marketing qualified account. So you want to have enough people within the account that are engaging with your collateral, that are engaging with your sales team, that you realize, okay, now we're actually ready to engage them and pass them on to sales. And then from a sales perspective, there's kind of two competing objectives. There's going to be either, you get them to sign up for the products. That's typically when you do like either a POC or even like push them into a trial kind of journey of saying, hey, we're going to handhold you and we're going to onboard people into the product, into the free version, like keep on showing you the value you can get so that hopefully they see that and then buy. Or you also have the thing where, you need to go through security. There's like a heavy procurement process before you can get access to their systems. And in that case, you have to go down the route of from like marketing activity to an opportunity directly.
And question for everyone here. So I want to know, like, what is the biggest source of your enterprise pipeline? So I know, like, Francis kind of broke it down based on like the typical company with like MQLs being the biggest, PQLs being smaller, and like product qualified accounts being smaller as well, and then target accounts. So put 1 in the chat if MQLs are the biggest share of your enterprise revenue. Super curious on that part. And then put 2 if it's power users, so your product qualified leads, if that's the biggest share of your enterprise revenue. Tammy, thanks for jumping in there for MQLs. So we're seeing a few more ones. And then if it's product qualified accounts, just put in 3 as far as if that is the biggest share of your enterprise revenue. And yes, I see some people already jumping in with 4. That's good. 4 is the marketing qualified accounts. Awesome. So we got a good mix. There's like, it's heavy on the 1s and 4s, which probably means most of the people here have sales-led companies, which is pretty common, but interesting. No one has 2s or 3s yet. Oh, Jocelyn, thank you. We got a 2. Awesome. Thank you for participating.
Yeah, no, definitely. And thanks for sharing. That's super helpful. And I think it does speak to this challenge that like it is kind of like the starting point that we see the most frequently on the market, that you're either like super heavy on this kind of like hand raiser motion, or you're going heavy on the target outbound component. And there is such a huge opportunity for a lot of the PLG companies out there to better convert their, PQLs to PQAs and then PQAs into enterprise deals. But it is a process that, requires a lot of, whiteboarding to figure out like, what is that journey? What are the different handoffs from one team to another? And making sure that you don't necessarily, you potentially don't hand over the accounts too early to another team and actually wait for the full nurturing to happen. For sure. And so in there, I mentioned like, we want to identify the product qualified accounts and then, turn them into opportunities. One of the strong challenges there is figuring out, okay, that's great. And if I'm a salesperson and you tell me, okay, like Sendbird is super active and great, I'm like, super. There's like 30 people from Sendbird that are using my product. I'm the sales rep. I'm looking at Salesforce, see all that good stuff. I'm excited. I'm going to close Sendbird. And now I realize, well, who do I talk to? What do I tell them? How do I even get started? Like it's overwhelming on the sell side because there's so many people that are active that they don't really know where to start. And that is one of the biggest challenges that we see in this kind of handoff process of saying we've identified these product qualified accounts and now we need to generate opportunities. And that's the section I wanted to cover here a little bit and share some examples and some ideas on how we've done this. And this is where we go back to the Lord of the Rings story, right? So we're saying we've identified this fellowship. There's a bunch of people in there. And now we're saying, well, we need to identify who's Gandalf, who's going to be Frodo, who's the Boromir, so on and so forth. And that is something that then the sales team can use to craft their message and go after the right people with the right message. And one of the basic ways to think about it is, and if you look kind of how people interact with your product, what you typically see is there's kind of like 2 big groups of people. So in this case, we're separating it by like an easy analysis you can run is on the one axis, you look at what is the activation propensity, like how frequently do these people activate based on job title. And on this other axis, we're looking at how frequently do these people convert, either by swiping their credit card or by being on the opportunity when it closes. And what typically we see with a lot of companies is that there's going to be these kind of clusters that form, and we're going to see kind of the core users, which are going to be people that will activate the product at a higher, on a more than average. And there are people that actually activate the product a lot less than average, but swipe the credit card a lot more than average. And so what's important there is to understand that this kind of, to some extent, statistically defines these two groups that you want to treat very separately, because now if you think of designing an onboarding journey and kind of a messaging for each of those, well, you want to make them different. So for the core user, really what you're thinking about is you want to tell them like, how do you get value from the product? Because you want them to engage with it and like understand the value they can get, like step after step, how they get more value. You want to get them, this is what we mentioned, right? So that'll get them to PQL. And then we want to get them to invite more team members, because that gives us the potential to then get to a PQA, because now there's like more people getting value from our product within this given account. And potentially you want them to swipe the credit card. It's kind of like either like a sales assist or a self-serve conversion on the, I guess, smaller side. So that's kind of one track that you think about for the core users.
Now, what are your thoughts on like choose your own adventure? Because it kind of caters to both approaches. One person could raise their hand and say, you know what, I need some extra help. I would like to talk to someone in sales. And then if they'd want, like they could just go into the product and see for themselves the value. So I'm curious to hear like what has been your kind of response and like data on just that approach, if you've seen that work.
Well, I think it's to some extent slightly almost like independent, or it's a separate track of saying there are people who just want to use the product on their own, and that's fine. And there are people who want help. I think let's say for people who want help, there's a question of like, what help are we going to give them? And that's where like a good salesperson is going to do discovery and understand, are you a core user? And when you say you want help, should I talk about how you're going to get value from the product? Or are you actually a buyer and you're saying, I want help? And the help you want is not about how you're going to use the product, but rather how your team is going to get value from the product. And I think that's the distinction that is so critical, that we have to think here. I'm talking about messaging, and it's messaging across all the different channels, right? It's the messaging on the kind of like onboarding sequences, the marketing sequences, and even like the sales conversation that they're going to have, right? If you're talking to an individual user of the product, you want to pitch the features, you want to talk about why it's better to use this product than the other one because it's easier, because this and that. But then if you're talking to the buyer persona, you don't want to talk about the granular features. They potentially don't even understand why it matters, because they're not the user of the product. And what you want to talk about is, as a team, how are you going to increase like the velocity or the efficiency or the happiness of your team, because the like premium plan that you have is so much better, or like security concerns or anything like that, if it's more of an IT buyer play. But I do think it is a great point, Wes, because I think that like sometimes we kind of think of it as, oh, like the buyer should go through like a hand raiser motion, and the core user should be like purely self-serve. I think that's a mistake. They're just like people that have different affinities, and they might want one or the other. And I think agree with Massimo, right? There's like companies where they're just always going to raise their hand, because that's like peace of mind. You don't really know if you can do anything in the product without getting in trouble with your IT team. But then your sales team is generally going to do a good job, or good salespeople are actually going to do a good job at this, of in the discovery, identifying who you are and then tailoring the conversation based off of that. And I think as marketers, it's also critical for us to make sure that we understand the journey for these kind of two different types of users. And yeah, I guess like this was just like one like example of how like a company did it, and this was the sales outreach that they would do to any person who was signing up that they thought was qualified enough to have a rep reach out to them. And what's interesting about it is that for an account executive who's signing up, like the call to action is really about using the product, and it's, you know, kind of specifying, hey, I see that you're in sales, therefore this is the use case that I think is the most relevant for you to get value from the products. It's really pushing on that, and less on, hey, let's get on a call, because the core user just like initially wants to get value from the product, and kind of let them tell you if they need help and they actually want to get on a call to get the overview. Whereas when you're talking to the buyer, it's more about, this is how like your team is going to get value from it, and we want to get on a call to tell you more about what this platform does and how it's relevant to your team. These are like two very different sets of messaging. And I think it's critical to, at least even again, like process perspective, just think about it and like put it on paper that we have 2 different types of people to onboard, and then figure out how from a process perspective, you are able to isolate one type of user from the other when they sign up. And maybe Eric, if you don't mind sharing for the team. Oh no, so, yeah, I mean, yeah. So you have that challenge, and you're doing it based on the personas, and I think that's the exact right approach to do. And it's, yeah, again, great starting point, and generally you see the like massive results there. Another story maybe on this that we've been seeing with a lot of the again like collaboration PLG products is so historically I think like there's been kind of core user, buyer. Those are fairly, I mean, they make sense. There's kind of a third group of people in the collaboration heavy products. And what I mean by that collaboration is like, if you think of, I think Kristen is still here, but like the Figmas, the Miro, the Envision, like these products where you have the expectation to have potentially like hundreds of users in the product, you're generally going to see that there are a set of account admins. And that's like, historically, that was the IT team. They're the ones who are kind of controlling who has access to what is the name of the instance, like how to handle, different like security settings for specific teams and stuff like that. That is almost like a third persona that is like really important to think about, because they are the ones who can also drive the enterprise sales, because they're the ones who are really going to care so much about about the enterprise plan, where you have better user management and all that stuff. And one easy way to identify who the admin of an account is going to be is just look at who is performing the admin style activities in your product, right? So like, who's inviting people, who's changing the name of the account, who's changing the image or the logo, or like who's changing the security settings. That person is most likely the one who's going to be okay to respond to your sales team when you say, hey, let's talk about user management and let's like give you access to our user management platform. That's kind of a third persona. And we see a lot of success when companies start targeting those from a sales perspective. And again, have a message that's very tailored towards user management and doesn't talk about how they're going to get value from the actual core features of the product.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Aaron had a good question too. Like, would a buyer and core user ever be the same person? And if so, how can we make sure our messaging is apt for both? So the good thing about this question is like a lot of the examples we've been sharing is really specific to B2B. And that's why like the accounts are so important. But in like the business to consumer space, a lot of times your user and buyer are the same people. If you think of like using chess.com, a chess app or something like that, you're going to sign up for it. And if you like playing it, you sign up for the trial, and then eventually you might actually upgrade. And so you are the user and the buyer. So I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page for that part, because a lot of the examples we're just going through are the B2B ones where you do have that distinction, and that distinction can be the difference between, you know, 6-figure or 7-figure deal as far as you approach it in your business.
And I think something to highlight here, right? So this section that we're talking about is kind of a follow-up to the making PLG succeed in enterprise selling. We still have this concept of the multiple funnels. And I think in the funnel where the buyer is the same as the core user is typically going to be more in the kind of like PQL funnel, where you're kind of like everyone almost like paying individually for every one of their seats, versus kind of like the enterprise sales where it is going to be like, you know, you go through procurements, like 6-figure deal, and you need to have that kind of like big review, and you have typically a buyer that is going to be a little bit further removed from the product. And so I think, yeah, that's why, again, this is like very, very specific to the enterprise funnel, but yeah, in the PQL funnel, you might want to have a slightly different approach. It's going to be more towards getting initial value from the product, and then actually once you reach the point where people are using it frequently, then actually talking about swiping the credit card. So we're getting close to the top of the hour, but we have like one last section, which slightly different component here. But another challenge that I see a lot of companies running into on the reporting side, and we'll kind of just like take one of the things that we see frequently, and another kind of element I recommend reading about is something called the Simpson paradox, which is like a statistical paradox that actually is very, very frequent in marketing and becomes really critical on the PLG side. And we have a blog article somewhere on our website that hopefully someone can send in the chat. But the long story short is the Simpson paradox can lead to you look at an average and it actually tells the wrong story. That's the kind of long story short. And so this particular example, so we're working with this company. They're kind of your typical freemium PLG, massive volumes of signups, right? I think they were in the 30 or I think like anyway multiple tens of thousands per month. And when we started working with them, they told us, well, look, when we actually plot our daily retentions, this is for a given cohort. After X days, how many are still active? What they were seeing is that they had this massive drop off on day one. Essentially, 50% of the people who would sign up for the product would never come back again to use the product after the first day. And that as a company was like, oh my God, like, this is like top priority. We absolutely need to fix this because yes, we're getting a ton of signups, but we're losing 50% of them on day one. So we need to fix this. And then if we fix it, everything is going to be gravy. The first thing that we did when we looked at this is like, okay, makes sense that the average numbers are that way. Maybe we should dive a little bit more into this and understand like what is the make of a given cohort. And the first thing that we did is we kind of broke it down by our definition of fit, but like an easy way, you could even start by saying, let's look at personal emails versus corporate emails, and then maybe like 100+ employees versus everything else. And what we found was that for every given cohort, about 3/4 of that cohort were actually low quality leads. And that's like a typical thing in PLG motions, is that because of that success and there's like so much like brand awareness and like people want to try out these products, you have a bunch of people who sign up for the product. There's a bunch of spam, there's a bunch of everything. And very few of those are percentage wise are actually like a good fit for your product. And when we actually looked at the daily retention against these different definitions of fit, what we found was that the lower quality ones, again, like 75% of the group, right? So they're the ones who are driving the average. That group was really the one that was not retained after day one, which makes sense. But when we were looking at the higher quality groups, we were seeing that they actually had a very decent even day 25 retention, where they're still at 75% of their users were still active 25 days after the sign up. And so really this company had a monetization issue because they were struggling to convert these groups into paying customers. And so what was really interesting about this was just to see how this like focus on just like looking at the average kind of daily retention led them to think they had a retention problem when really they had a monetization problem. And that's when actually deploying sales against these people and starting to talk to the folks who are still active led them to actually start closing more deals and getting a lot more revenue. And that was like a massive success internally. And the funny thing is that they didn't need to change much. They just needed to look at the data the right way. And this is something that is becoming increasingly harder because there's this challenge, I think, in PLG where now more and more of the data is living in like Snowflake or Redshift or some data warehouse. And as marketers, it's harder for us to get access to it. And so this is something that I kind of recommend working with either your data science team or BI team to be able to say, hey, actually, can we have like these kind of cohort analyses broken by some definition of what's a good fit for us versus what isn't, so that we're able to get a better picture of where we might have issues to tackle versus where the opportunities are, essentially. That's pretty much it. I know we're at time. This is like pretty dense, I think, but hopefully it was insightful and and there was like good stuff out of it. So in the next few minutes, like I don't know, Wes, if you have questions or if we want to pick any questions from the chat.
Absolutely. So for everyone, thank you so much for joining us. If you do have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I'm going to start off with one of the questions that I've been waiting to ask Francis for a while now. So here it is. You ready? Yeah. So where do you start with the product qualified accounts? We talked a ton about that. I think that was one of the sections we had the most questions. But there's just such a need for like a product qualified accounts for a lot of B2B SaaS companies. Like you can't just look at the user to understand the whole story of Lord of the Rings. It'd just be like in that story. It's like if you only know Gandalf, it'd be a pretty boring movie if it was just Gandalf. And it's like, it really is about all the characters. What else is going on in that account? So where do you get started for a product qualified account? Since most folks here, they have marketing qualified leads or marketing qualified accounts. That was the most common one.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's I would say the baseline is start with, aggregating the number of active users you have on your product accounts, and then just sorting by that number. Step two is running some kind of a little bit more sophisticated aggregation to look at based on domain potentially, so that you take people that might be active even on your website that are active through marketing collaterals, might not be in the product, but actually are engaged and belong to the same buying entity. And that's where then, you might have the thing of needing to roll up in Salesforce based on accounts versus just like doing it at the domain level. But I would say the most basic place to start is really the active users or active people in the last 30 days and just like stack rank them just for the sake of starting the initiative on the sales side of having to crack the nut of reaching out to these folks and actually being able to yield some deals. And then over time, you can go to something more sophisticated to build that qualification.
Okay. And like you mentioned this whole concept of like rolling up into one account. You have like 30 users, they're all over the place.
Yeah.
Roll it up. Like what are some ways you could start to actually do that? Because like, I mean, there's tooling, but there's also just like Excel sheets. There's a million ways you could approach it. One will break your neck. There's some simpler ways. So like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because it really depends on the data stack that you have. I think the first place to start would be a Salesforce. I think it's fairly straightforward to implement some kind of like either use a roll-up helper or lean data. I do find lean data to be potentially a little bit expensive and a little bit excessive, especially in like PLG where you don't want to create every single user into Salesforce. So that's one that can be tricky. And then if you have all your data in a data warehouse, like one of the ways to do it is ask your engineering team essentially to parse the domain from the emails and just run a count on that. The challenge you're going to have there is that then like you want to make sure you exclude all the personal emails. You are going to have garbage in there of like the Gmails or the all the typos of Gmail, Hotmail, and all that stuff that are going to create these bigger things. But at least it's a good starting point. And then you can kind of cherry pick the accounts that you want to pass on to sales. And then I guess like a next step is kind of working with, I mean, it's kind of what we do. So like a tool like Matkudu can help on that. But I would say like that's a place you want to go once you've at least like tried the initiative of having sales reach out to these accounts. So yeah, that would be I think those would be the two baselines. I think Excel is really rough at these volumes. But yeah.
Awesome. And I think Amari was wondering, do you have a collective similar to app queues? Yeah.
We actually are starting one. So we'll follow up on that one. We're actually kind of building a community of marketing ops folks who want to learn and operationalize more data science. So I think it's it's a big topic, and I do think a lot of marketers out there are to some extent struggling a little bit because a lot of the data stack has been taken out of their hands and is going into this like data team, like the data ops team, and it just like makes iterations a lot harder.
Awesome. Well, Omari has about 5 exclamation points. So excitement.
Nice.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, for sticking around until the very end. This has been an absolute blast. You will be sent the slides, the recording, if you want to send it to a colleague. If you found this useful, I would encourage you to do that to make sure that they also know, get them on board, team, product qualified accounts, get them thinking about this.
All that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Any other kind of final words you have, Francis?
No, I would say just like feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, on Twitter. If you have any questions, I'm always happy to talk shop. So yeah, don't worry. It doesn't have to be, it's not I won't ask for a big check at the end necessarily, but yeah, if you want to talk about your current setup and PLG motion, always happy to do that. So please do feel free to reach out.
Awesome. And everyone have an amazing week. Bye for now.
All right. Cheers.